not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from you. As we read from the Holy Scriptures, may our souls be satisfied and our hearts prepared for service. Amen. Our reading today, we're going to take a little jump. I know we just heard the Christmas narrative, but this is one of the lectionary readings for today. And we're going to have fun talking about how it fits together. We're going to look at 1 Samuel chapter 2, verses 18 through 36. Samuel was ministering before the Lord, a boy wearing a linen ephod. His mother used to make for him a little robe and take it to him each year when she went up with her husband to offer the yearly sacrifice. Then Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife and say, "May the Lord repay you with children by this woman for the gift that she has made to the Lord." And then they would return to their home. And the Lord took note of Hannah. She conceived and bore 3 sons and 2 daughters, and the boy Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord. Now Eli was very old. He heard all that his sons were doing to all Israel, and how they lay with the women who served at the entrance to the tent of meeting. He said to them, "Why do you do such things? For I hear of your evil dealings from all these people. No, my sons, it is not a good report that I hear the people of the Lord spreading abroad. If one person sins against another, someone can intercede for the sinner with the Lord. But if someone sins against the Lord, who can make intercession?" But they would not listen to the voice of their father, for it was the will of the Lord to kill them. Now the boy Samuel continued to grow both in stature and in favor with the Lord and with the people. A man of God came to Eli and said to him, "Thus the Lord has said, I revealed myself to the family of your ancestor in Egypt, when they were slaves to the house of Pharaoh. I chose him out of all the tribes of Israel to be my priest, to go up to my altar, to offer incense, to wear an ephod before me. And I gave to the family of your ancestor all my offerings by fire from the people of Israel. Why then look with greedy eye at my sacrifices and my offerings that I commanded, and honor your sons more than me by fattening yourselves on the choicest parts of every offering of my people Israel? Therefore the Lord God of Israel declares, I promised that your family and the family of your ancestors should go in and out before me forever. But now the Lord declares, far be it from me, for those who honor me I will honor, and those who despise me shall be treated with contempt. See, a time is coming when I will cut off your strength and the strength of your ancestors' families, so that no one in your family will live to old age. Then in distress you will look with greedy eye upon all the prosperity that shall be bestowed upon Israel, and no one in your family shall ever live to old age. The only one of you whom I will not cut off from my altar will be spared to weep out his eyes and grieve his heart. All the members of your household shall die by the sword. The fate of your 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, shall be the signs to you. Both of them shall die on the same day. I will raise up for myself a faithful priest, who shall do according to what is in my heart and in my mind. I will build him a sure house, and he shall go in and out before my anointed one forever. Everyone who is left in your family shall come to implore him for a piece of silver or a loaf of bread, and shall say, please put me in one of the priest's places, that I may eat a morsel of bread. Right. It's a nice bright follow-up to Christmas. Okay. I didn't create the lectionary. This is what it says. Is fitting. Sort of. Today is a multi-step sermon. So I am first going to kind of go through the story and try and put it together in a particular way. And then I'm going to talk about how it's not actually probably saying what it sounds like it's saying. And then I'm going to go off on why I'm kind of annoyed at why this is coming up today and how it's being used. So I'm hoping by setting out that roadmap in advance, the sermon will make more sense. Okay, we're backtracking a lot in time from Jesus, right? We are now backtracking to the time of Eli and Samuel, which is before Israel and Judah had kings, right? This is before Saul and David and Solomon and all that. This is the time of judges, where each of the tribes was kind of doing their own thing. And as needed, kind of charismatic leaders would rise up and sort of bring together the groups to deal with a common threat. So right now, Eli is sort of the top dog in the territory. He is the high priest at Shiloh, north a little bit of Jerusalem. And he has been brought, we skipped the first chapter and whatnot, but he has been brought a child. He blessed a woman who was barren, and when she conceived and gave birth, well, when the child was old enough, she brought Samuel to the temple at Shiloh and said, here you go. She gave her son to the temple to work there, to grow up there, to be trained there. And it's probably not, that's probably not necessarily a unique thing. He's probably not the only person at the time to have this done. It wasn't a common practice. If you think back to like the medieval Europe, children would at times be brought to like monasteries or whatnot, right? So they could grow up there and be taught to read and write, because most people couldn't do that. And they'd grow up in service to God, to whatever it was that group was doing. So Samuel is a child who is living at the temple, working at the temple, learning things from Eli and his family who runs it. That's kind of the setup. And so the beginning of our reading is every year his mother comes and brings him a new robe or says hi or something, and then they go back home. Now, hypothetically, since Eli was the head priest here, when he eventually dies, that role would be taken over by his sons. Probably the oldest officially, but with help from the other, Hophni and Phinehas. But we learn in here that they aren't stellar people. Before this reading, I was tempted to back it up, but it was already such a long reading, I didn't feel like I should add even more. Before this reading, there's a whole chunk about how they mishandle offerings that are being brought to the temple. They take chunks out of the offering while they are in the process of being burned or cooked. They require people to give them chunks of offering before they'll even start the process of burning. There's a lot of mishandling, it sounds like, of offerings being made to the benefit of themselves. Because the way a lot of priests in here are supported is by the leftovers from offerings. Like when it talks, there's tons and tons of pages in the Old Testament law about bringing offerings of different animals, of grains, of different things to the temple. And people would bring those offerings, and portions of those offerings would be burned up entirely, but big chunks of them were, burning offerings was generally speaking cooking them. And so God's portion of the offerings was what cooked out in the process, and what was left is what supported the people who worked at the temple. So this is true in Egypt, this is true throughout a lot of Mesopotamia. The offerings, a portion of them went to God, especially the fat, right, that cooks off when they cook it. This was also the case up in Greece. Those portions go to God. What's left is then dinner for the priesthood and the clergy and all of the people that work for the temple. That's their income. So it isn't inherently a problem that they're taking some, but they're taking it before they're supposed to, or more than they're supposed to. And then we find out in the beginning here, they're also sleeping with the women that work at the front, which, given that they're the high priests, that's very much a manager taking advantage of interns kind of situation, and is just bad. It is just, there is no appropriate scenario for that. Since they're adults, they're probably also both married. Like, it doesn't talk about their spouses, but generally speaking, marriages were arranged. I'm sure Eli had already arranged marriages for his children at this point. So they're problematic. And Eli goes to them and accuses them of this, but they won't change. They're not willing to give up whatever benefits they think they're getting from their position. And there's this beautifully super concerning sentence that I would love to do a whole sermon on one day in verse 25. It was the will of the Lord to kill them. Yeah, did nobody catch that the first time reading through? That is exactly what it says. I checked it out in Hebrew. It was the will of the Lord to kill them. Someday we'll have to do a whole sermon just on the places where stuff like that shows up. But all that aside, a man of God, Haishal, this is a weirdly specific title. It sounds really generic, but the title man of God is not commonly used except for specific people like Elijah and Elisha, which come much, much later. That's towards the end, really, of the period of the kingdoms. And so this is a prophet of some kind, completely unnamed. And very strange that some random person shows up to Eli, who is the high priest, and who doesn't seem to be himself doing anything wrong. It's a little bit odd that God wouldn't chastise Eli directly, but instead goes through this man of God. But at any rate, he gives Eli some really bad news. Really long, really bad news. Not just, I'm punishing your kids for being terrible, but I am going to wipe out your entire family line. Huzzah! It feels a little excessively harsh, I think. But not only are they all going to die by the sword, specifically murdered, but also the couple, anyone that survives will basically spend their days suffering in some way. That's Eli's message. And once they're all gone, God will choose a new family to serve, a new high priest that will follow in his ways. It has this very prefiguring of Jesus kind of sound, doesn't it? It feels like that pops up in the New Testament somewhere, maybe. But if in the story, it sounds kind of like they're setting up Samuel, doesn't it? Because we start off talking about this boy Samuel, who is learning the right way to do things, living in the temple, and this long story about Eli and his terrible sons is interrupted by one line that just brings up, but Samuel grew in stature and grew in rightness with the Lord. The story sounds like it's setting up Samuel. But here is the complicating factors in all of this. It's not. Okay? It is neither setting up probably Jesus, nor is it setting up Samuel. It is, in fact, talking about an event that happens within Samuel's lifetime, or just after Samuel's lifetime. Saul, King Saul, right, becomes king, does some bad stuff. God gets kind of mad. There's a whole civil war with David thing. Eventually Saul dies, David becomes king. We've gone through all of that before, but just as a recap. During that kind of civil war period between Saul and David, Saul kills all the priests at Shiloh for siding with David. So all of Eli's family, his descendants, end up getting killed. His sons get brought to a battle with Saul and get killed on the battlefield. And after that, later Saul kills all the rest of the priesthood there. And they are replaced by a guy whose family is Zadok, the priesthood of Zadok, which we don't hear about a whole lot. But that is the foreshadowing situation, which makes it really complicated, right, reading this, because the narrative is very clearly driving in one direction, towards Samuel. And we, reading after a whole lot of other things has happened, hear it and say, oh, that sounds like some kind of prophetic text about Jesus, which we'll talk about later. You can understand it that way, but I don't think that's intended. But it assumes that you know, a lot of chunks of this book assume that you kind of know the whole book. And I don't know how they expect you to understand it as you're reading it if you have to already understand all of it to read it. Some great circular logic in there. So, why does this reading come up now, the Sunday after Christmas? All right? It sort of doesn't. Okay. If you look at the lectionary wanted me to read 4 verses. The little chunk about Samuel living and growing up at the temple and whatever, and interacting with his mother and her blessed. And then that one line down below about him growing in stature and in rightness before God. And the entire rest of the story around it is not part of the lectionary reading. Just cut that out. Okay? Now, why? Why would they do that? Because if you skip the whole Eli and his sons thing, then it sounds like this boy growing up in the temple, studying things, learning with the elders, is supposed to match with the gospel reading for today from Luke about when Mary and Joseph go to the temple and then they go home and realize Jesus isn't with them, and they go back and find him hanging out at the temple talking with the priests and the scribes and the teachers learning, right? So the lectionary cuts out these couple of random little verses about Samuel that sound kind of like young Jesus and says, there's your reading. Okay. That feels gross to me, personally, right? Slashing out like 3 sentences from a story and then saying, look, if you ignore everything else, these 3 sentences sound like something else. Huzzah! I make a lot of fun of the lectionary. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, but it does stuff like this, and it just irritates me because how are we supposed to understand what's going on in the text in fragments? That assumes that the truth, the lessons, the ideas that we are supposed to hold on to are encapsulated somehow in these tiny little isolated fragments, completely devoid of whatever story or whatever history or whatever thing they're in. And I try really hard to avoid doing that, because that leads us in weird directions that don't make sense. So this is sometimes called proof texting, and people do it all the time. Listen to any preacher on TV or on a radio. If you read a lot of, not even contemporary like religious writing, you go back through the greats throughout time. You go to the patristics, the early church fathers and stuff. They do the same thing all the time, where they cut out these little lines and they smash a bunch of them together and they make a point out of it. And it's like, but if you keep going, any one of those things sounds like something very, very different. And some Bible authors do this too. Matthew, I love the Gospel of Matthew. It has some great stuff. But the author of the Gospel of Matthew does this constantly because he wants to come up with the case that Jesus fulfills all of these different prophecies, right? So he goes back through Old Testament texts and finds any little scrap of a sentence that can be read to look like Jesus somehow, and drags it into the gospel text to say, look, here's this prophecy about Jesus and how he fulfilled it, right? Because he is positive Jesus is the fulfillment of these prophecies. He just wants to find as many as he possibly can and drag them forward, even if like here, they don't really fit. Like, they're not really looking at Jesus. So, I'll give two really good examples contemporaneously of where this goes wrong, okay? You know those little calendars you can get where every day has like a quote on it or a pretty picture or something? We've all seen these. Okay, I found one once. It was Bible verses, and of course it's only like one verse on each page. So you're not getting a story, but that's fine. Paging through, there was one page that had a quote. I forget if it's the Matthew or the Luke version, but it kind of shows up in both. And the quote was, they didn't have like the standard translation of it. It was one of those translations where they're going for the gist of it rather than the actual words. But it was, bow before me and the whole world shall be yours, or something like that. And it sounds like this pretty, acknowledge God, bring God into your heart, acknowledge him as Lord, and God opens up the whole world to you. The quote is from the temptation of Jesus. It's literally Satan tempting Jesus, saying, bow before me and I'll give you the whole world. And I'm like, I don't feel like that's the kind of quote you want to pull out of context and put in this little calendar, right? It sounds innocuous, but then you go to it, it's like, oh, we're supposed to say no to that, not yes. No, that one, I shouldn't probably use that one. There's one I learned yesterday, and it's really, we're all adults, this will be fine. There's some Bible scholars I really like to listen to, and one of them was talking about the expression, spare the rod, spoil the child, right, that people know generally, and it's not an exact quote. It comes from this place in Proverbs, where spare the rod and you hate your child, for correction leads to godliness, something. But the actual quote that everyone uses, spare the rod, spoil the child, comes from a poem in the 1700s, I think, that was written by a man talking about how to spice up your intimate life with your partner. It has nothing to do with educating children, the quote that we get. But we pull that out of context, and we say, oh, it sounds like this Bible verse. And then we ignore all of the steps in between and pretend that's all it means. It's not the same. So, okay. So I went through the story of it. I went through what it's actually kind of talking about and why it annoys me a little bit. Here's the takeaway for all of me ranting and raving here, okay? It matters. I would have loved to have done a sermon on some of these specific things that are said in the text. But this feels like a much more important point to me, a much more relevant point to our lives when we're trying to figure out who to listen to and how to interpret things and what to do with our lives as people of faith. Like can we just take one quick little snippet and say that must be true by itself, I believe that, and I'm going to run with that? My short answer is no, but regardless, this story is given to us the Sunday after Christmas because cut out of context it sounds like it could be comparable to Jesus as a child at the temple, or that part at the end sort of prefigures Jesus as our high priest who intercedes for us, right? Which does come up in the New Testament. This does get kind of quoted there. But the author in here is not writing about that. The author here is talking about the end of Eli's line when they're killed by Saul, and the bringing up of Zadok, because the particular author in that section does this time and time again. They're fitting together various manuscripts to make one story, and they are making weird cross references that assume you have all the manuscripts in front of you. It's messy. But we get it because it sounds like this sort of thing. And it is totally fine to draw parallels. Do it. That is totally, when I read the story and you think, oh, that sounds kind of like Jesus here. When we read something out of here and you're like, oh, this sounds a lot like this actual situation in my life. Drawing parallels is fine. In fact, it's good. That is what you are supposed to do. Is hear these things and hear how these stories and the instructions in them and the lessons that they teach connect to your life still, because humans haven't changed that much in 3,000 years. And all of these kind of situations are still relevant for your life. So hear those connections, but not in little bits of isolation. Don't chop it apart and say, this half of a sentence sounds true, and ignore everything else that's around it. We don't live in half sentences. We don't live in fragments. We live a story. And this is full of stories. All right? And if we lose the forest for the trees, for a tree, if we stop and call it good, we're missing out on the forest that was given, that we are supposed to keep walking through. So draw parallels. But those parallels are not objectively there. You drawing that parallel does not mean that's what the author is thinking about. That is you making that connection, which is good and fine and spiritually appropriate. But don't retroject your parallel back into the text and say that's what they're saying and what they mean. Acknowledge that it's more complicated than that. This is a mess. It's supposed to be. That's a good thing. This is a mess because this answers questions like Jesus answers questions. How many times does Jesus give a straight, direct answer to a question? Never. Someone asks him a very simple, straightforward question, and he tells them a story. He gives them a parable. And in fact, if you read the different versions of that, the parables are a little different even between how people remember them. And the explanations are a little different between, and none of those explanations really even make all that much sense necessarily. It's not supposed to be simple and cut and dry. This isn't Legos, right? It's messier than that, and that is a good thing. This is parables all the way down. Hear it that way, live it that way, engage with it that way. Use this story to help connect to your story. Because stories are all it is. Great ones, true ones, meaningful ones. Stories. Amen.